We're in the 26th letter. Excuse me. And in this letter, as we started yesterday, it's based on a teaching in the Zohar, where a superficial reading of it would sound as if the Torah that we're learning now, for example, Tanya, Zohar, mystical Kabbalistic teachings, that this is an expression of the tree of life. And it gives you life. And no doubt it does give us life. No doubt we are learning together day in, day out, because I definitely feel this. Even teaching this, I don't even know, but perhaps even more so teaching it, how life-giving it is. In other areas of the Torah, in other words, what's called nigla. Nigla means the revealed part of the do's and don'ts. Halacha, Jewish law. What's valid, invalid, kosher, not kosher, pure, impure. That those laws, since they're speaking about light, darkness, pure, impure, right? So it must be an expression of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is klipa. And that's the way it sounds from learning the Zohar. The Alter Rebbe is making an argument against that. He made it yesterday, and he continues today. How to truly understand the Zohar will be in our next class, but the arguments that we cannot understand it, that parts of the Torah are not the tree of life, that parts of the Torah are an admixture of klipas noiga, of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. So the first argument the Alter Rebbe made yesterday, if you recall, is, we call Eitz Chaim Hi Lamachasikim. It is the tree of life for those who hold on to it. And we actually, when the Torah is read and we finish and you do Hagbah, you lift the Torah, that phrase is said. Many places it's sung, like here. And it's referring to the Torah scroll itself. It's referring to the entire Torah. So you can't say that it's a tree of life only for part. Furthermore, the very teachings of Kabbalah, very teachings of the Zohar, in its day was actually concealed, and whatever was expressed or taught was in secret to very few people. It only became a relevant teaching to all people, or to all Jewish people, really. In the times of the Arizal, in the 16th century, where he said that now this is something that all of us need to learn. But before that, not. So what? Jewish people only had a connection to the Torah teachings that is an expression of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Klipa of Klipa? Can't be. Furthermore, the Rashbi, the Reb Shimon Bar Yochai himself, he spent 13 years in a cave, hiding from the Romans with his son. And all they did was study Torah the whole time. For them to study the Zohar would take him 2-3 months. And then, what else they do? They need to repeat it, because we're talking about people that are just not like me. I have to repeat till it gets into my head. They're righteous people. It gets, they learn it. It's in their head. So after 2-3 months, what did they learn? Well, most of the time they were studying, arguments in Talmudic reasoning to adjudicate and come to an understanding of Jewish law. So not only the law, but even the arguments, the back and forth, that sounds like could be from Kalipa. No, it can't be. It's holy teachings. And furthermore, we see the notion in the Talmud that prayer is based on Kabbalistic teachings. Prayer is about creating a union between male and female parts of the divine and bringing light into this world. So it's based on Kabbalah, and yet those who are great sages, were their primary function, their primary almost completely their devotion was to the study of Torah, that they did not need to disrupt their Torah study, even when it comes to study of halachic issues of pure, impure, and civil law, and so on, for prayer. That's how important their learning was. So how do we understand that? And finally, as the sages say, that after the destruction of the Second Holy Temple, the presence of God is only found in 4 cubits of halacha, of Jewish law. So, of course, it can't mean that. And the Alter Rebbe today makes further argument. And the further argument is that when Mashiach will come, so in the teachings of the Zohar, it sounds as if, once the spirit of impurity is removed from this world, which will be in the times of Mashiach, the Messianic era, then we will only have the tree of life that will sustain us. Meaning, then we won't need the tree of knowledge of good and evil to give us sustenance. And teachings then will only be of a mystical dimension. But the Alter Rebbe says, well, that's not possible, because there's a lot of ritual law that we need to know how to perform them, like offerings. How do you perform that? So you need to know the law. Furthermore, a simple thing like slaughtering an animal to make it kosher, or as an offering, or to eat it as it being kosher. Well, there's lots of laws of that, and to have a perfect knife, just parenthetically, the knife has to be without any nick. The fingernail has to run across it by the shochat, the slaughterer, to make sure that it is razor sharp, in order, because if there's some pigima, if there's some nick, it renders invalid the animal in slaughtering. It's not kosher. That's how careful you have to be. So what, a person's going to be born knowing these laws? They're going to have to study these laws of what it means to slaughter properly, that when you do the actual slaughtering, that you're not supposed to press, you have to move it with one simple stroke. You can't pass under instead of over the windpipe and gullet. You can't slaughter and pause, make an interruption. All these things, but a person's not going to know them just intuitively. So you need to study those laws. So what do you mean? What does it mean to suggest that the Zohar is saying that in the times of Mashiach we will that we won't study the Jewish law? We'll just have the mystical dimension of Torah. Furthermore, laws of impurity, like a woman who gives birth. So there's laws that in reference to what it means to be purified, and so on. All these things will need to be learned in order to be able to observe them properly. Furthermore, we see in the Gemara and the Talmud itself, it says it gives an example of a question is asked, and it says this is a hilchos de Mashiach. This is a law for Mashiach. Well, in other words, it's a law that will be in times of Mashiach. Or this is something that we don't understand now, the Talmud says, and we'll have to wait for Elijah the prophet, who will be the forerunner of Mashiach, and he'll respond and answer to us this question that we have of Talmudic reasoning and adjudication of the law. So it must be that even in times of Mashiach, we're going to study these laws. Well, it must be then these laws are an expression of the tree of life, even today. Not just then. Furthermore, the Alter Rebbe makes another argument. There's another point that we made, that the scholars were being sustained by ignorant people. So the mistake that people think, oh, that's why the scholars had to learn those areas of the law of what's valid, invalid, pure, impure, kosher, not kosher, because if they're being helped and sustained by the ignorant, then they don't know the law, so they need to know the law or study it in order to make sure that everything is done properly. But the truth is, they sustain themselves. Many of them, as we study in the Torah, in the Talmud, the scholars had their own fields and vineyards, and they're just like illiterate and ignorant people had. Nevertheless, they still engaged in these laws of what is pure, impure, what is permitted and prohibited. For example, there were all sorts of pairs of leading sages who lived in the time of the Second Temple, and they had many, many students. They studied esoteric, mystical teachings with them, but in secret, quiet, behind closed doors. As we mentioned earlier, as that was back in the day, that's the way it was done. It was only in the 16th century that the Arizal said, now it's something to proliferate and make it available to all. But then they, behind closed doors, but yet they had thousands of students, as we learn in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers, and they taught them. Well, what did they teach them? They taught them law. Well, what did they teach them the law if they didn't need it for a practical reason? Because they own their own field, so they didn't have to know the law to make sure that the illiterate are not doing something incorrect. They learned it because it's Torah. It's the tree of life. It's life-giving. It is an expression of God's divine wisdom and holiness, not just the inner dimension, not just the mystical Kabbalistic dimension, Hasidus, but even that part of law. And that's how the Alter Rebbe concludes here in today's class. Just to maybe bring it into other terms that the Alter Rebbe doesn't use, just to maybe make it a little more meaningful, the concept over here. From a human dimension, a person could think the following. When I study mystical teachings, well, that's divine, because mystical teachings is a discussion about the divine. It's a talk, an understanding of God and godliness. So I call it, God's first name and last name. His first name is God. His last name is godliness. What's the difference? God is God, and godliness is they like to tend to divine attributes of God. That's godliness. It's one with God, part of God. But God is even beyond that. In any case, the point is that when we study mystical, when we study Tanya, we study mystical teachings, Zohar, it's an awareness, a direct connection to the divine wisdom. One might erroneously think that when you're studying Talmud and the arguments that go there, it's only like a means to an end, so I can know what the law is, and the law is only a means to an end, so I could just fulfill the mitzvah. So it's sort of like not an end in itself, because it's not talking about God himself. It's not an awareness of God. It's about what I got to do. So therefore, the learning is kind of like a means to that end. And therefore, yes, it's Torah, but it doesn't have the same holiness to it. That's a mistake. Why? Because the law itself is, and the arguments to make up the law is, Eitz Chaim, it's the tree of life. It's divine wisdom. It's the arguments themselves that are only a forerunner, a forerunner to the adjudication of law, is in itself divine wisdom. It's divine wisdom. Therefore, when we understand a law that, there's an argument between Reuven and Shimon before a judge and about, so the argument that the Torah speaks about, back and forth, is a part, not just of Jewish law, but part of the divine wisdom that's one with God. Therefore, understanding it is understanding divine wisdom, and therefore connecting to the tree of life that sustains us and gives us godly, holy, divine connection. This is what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. So what we're left with, and I hope you'll be able to sleep tonight, even though we're left with a lot of questions on the Zohar, a lot of difficulties in its teaching. So the Alter Rebbe, so to speak, ripped it apart. And what's going to happen in our next class is going to put it back together and give us the real understanding of what the Zohar means. And as I said, I hope you lose some sleep over this. You shouldn't lose sleep over anything else. But Torah learning that, you're at a point that, this is, I don't get it. I'm bothered. This is, in other words, it should mean so much to me. But I'm talking to myself right now. And as I see myself in the camera here, so I'm talking to myself that this should be so meaningful to me, that this is what my mind is engaged in. This is what my heart is desiring to understand and to more deeply appreciate and connect with. That this is where my occupation will be, so much so that when I go to sleep, I'm still preoccupied with this. What's the answer? Well, next class, we will provide that. In the meantime, let it be in our heads, going over and over. All right. Leah from Fort Myers, welcome. Bachia and David, Montreal, welcome. Donna is here with us from Texas. Denise and Linda, welcome. Henry from LA or California, welcome. Pamela from Oakton, Virginia. Paul, Deborah from Long Island, New York. Thank you. From San Diego. Henry. Well, Darren. Okay, good question. Let me get back to you. Norman, welcome. Russ, welcome aboard. Cindy from Florida. Leora, Boker Tov. Erica from Norway, welcome. Sunday, God willing, 10:30 will be the class. John from California. All right, folks, thank you for joining. Please share this with others. I'm Rabbi Ronnie Fine, coming to you from Chabad Zich and Kadesh in Montreal, Canada, where it's a privilege and a pleasure to share with you the Tanya. Have a wonderful day.